All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Growing a Chatops Platform and Having Fun with Clojure. My name is Trevor Hartman. I work at eBay, where I spend a lot of time hacking on Yetibot, open source, but also working on platform architecture, trying to make people more efficient at their jobs. You can find me under devth at all the usual places if you want to follow. So first of all, what is Yetibot? Before we dive in, I invite you to join Yetibot Slack. You can join the Clojure North channel where I'm going to be doing a lot of demos. Feel free to run commands and inject some chaos into the presentation if you like. You can see in the channel that all the Clojure North tweets are showing up, so if you also tweet, it should show up in the channel. So fundamentally, Yetibot is a chatbot. It takes commands and returns responses. So there's a ton of commands built in. We're only going to go over a few today. This is Wikipedia. We could look up the weather. We could get that in Fahrenheit if we like for us US people. It also has GitHub integration. So on any command, you can ask for help and see all the subcommands available. For example, we could list the open PRs on a given org, like Yetibot, or say we want to look at Clojure, or Cognitect, or Juxt, or so on. We can also list repos. It also has lots of kind of fun and strange commands built in. We can ask Yetibot to repeat a command any number of times. We could also pipe commands, which allows you to compose multiple expressions or multiple commands into a single expression. Another recent command is CLJ quote that a new contributor added just last week. So looking at this command, you can see the output contains quite a few pieces of data, but let's say we wanted to grab just the text of that. So an interesting thing that Yetibot does is it propagates the data that's used to derive the output of a command across pipes. So we can actually look at the raw data instead of the formatted string representation. So if we say data show, we get a Clojure map back. Then we could pass data to keys and see what keys are available. And that will allow us to drill into any one of those pieces of the map. So if we wanted to grab just the text, for example, we could pipe that to a CLJ command, which allows us to access that data using the Clojure language. And that map would be available as a var called data. So that kind of illustrates the power of data behind pipes, command composition, and being able to access any pieces of a map using the CLJ command. So the CLJ is just a Clojure interpreter. It's executing Clojure commands in Clojale. So hopefully you can't bring Yetibot down. So next, we'll look at aliases. If we run all temps, this lists the weather for locations that all the Yetibot core contributors live in. So Montana, that's me. We have another contributor in Bucharest, New York, and Paris. So if we want to see how this works, we can ask for help on all temps. And we can see it's an alias for this expression. So if we break that down, we can ask for help on locs. And see that's a list for these locations. We can construct a list just using the list command and commas to separate each item in the list. If we run that, we can see it outputs each item on its own line. Next, xargs. As you'd expect, that's a way to run a command for every item in a list. So to demo that, we could pass locs over to xargs and prepend it with a string. The next part of the alias is loctemp. And this one's a little more complicated. So we're grabbing the weather for the positional argument that you pass it. That's the syntax for alias arguments. And then we pipe that to render. And the way render works is it allows us to render a Selmer template over the data that was passed across a pipe. So again, if we run weather for a location, we can look at all the data behind that that's available and tap into that using the render command. So, sure. How's that? Okay. So look temp. So if we ran that for a given location, we get kind of an alternate, more concise representation of weather instead of the longer form. So drilling back up to all temps, the last part is just sort. And so when we run that, we get the temperature or the weather for a given set of locations sorted. Another thing Yetibot has built in is the ability to scrape and parse HTML from a website. So it can scrape and parse HTML and then drill in using CSS selectors. So if we want to try that out, we could scrape clojurenorth.com and grab the schedule text from the site. Then with piping, we could grab a random item from the schedule or look at the last 3 items with tail 3, the first 4, and so on. We could also alias that if we'd like, so we don't have to type this expression every time. So the way you define an alias is you give it a name on the left hand and then quote the right hand side for the command. And this command can contain any sort of expression, including pipes and sub-expressions. So now when we run Clojure North, as we expect, we get the schedule. Another alias that we're playing with is HN. So HN grabs a random item from Hacker News and prints it out. So if we deconstruct this, we can see it's an alias for JSON. So JSON just parses JSON and allows you to just access the data. You can drill into it, or you can use the render command like we're doing here to access the map. So this illustrates sub-expressions. You can see the $ parentheses is a sub-expression inside of the outer kind of JSON. So if we just run that sub-expression itself, we get a random ID of a story. So we're embedding that inside this JSON command and grabbing the data for that story ID. And we can pretty print that by passing it to data show. And then the last part is rendering it. So we render the title URL and then pass the ID to this URL to access the comment thread. And if you're not sure why it's surrounded by popcorn, as we all know, this is the best way to prepare for reading a Hacker News thread. Okay, last one. So yetishould. This one's maybe a little more bizarre. Let's just run a few examples. So here's another example of an alias. None of this is actually built into Yetibot. It's all kind of runtime. And so let's deconstruct that by asking for help on yetishould. So we can see it's a list of 4 memes to pick from and grabs a random item from that. Looks like we're getting some tweets from the other room. Next, we pass it to meme, and then this is the positional argument for arguments across pipes. So it takes whatever's the previous value and puts it there. And then next, just Yetibot list should not, must not. Take a random item from that. And finally, rand should. So you can see the backtick surrounded part of this pipe of this command is a sub-expression. So if we said that kind of demonstrates what's going on. It executes the innermost sub-expression first, and then just simply passes that as an argument to the outer command, which is what we're doing here. So if we look at rand should, we could run a few examples of that. And if we ask for help, we can see how it works. So it's an alias for this kind of composite expression. And if we look at rand letter, that generates a letter, but that's also not built in. It's actually an alias for a built-in command, range from 65 to 91 inclusive, grab a random item from that range, from that list, and then pass it to JavaScript to convert it to a string or a character representation. So if we try that a few times, grab rand letter and pass it over to complete should I. Complete is one of the first commands that I built on Yetibot, and it just simply uses Google Completes API, which is pretty fun. So rand letter piped to complete should I is what gives us these kind of bizarre and fun completions. Next, we just grab a random item from that and then use the sed command to remove should I from the string and then trim whitespace on both sides. So if we zoom back out to yetishould, hopefully that makes sense and kind of illustrates the power of combining multiple commands and aliasing them for fun and strange results. So a little bit of the backstory on Yetibot. So way back in 2011, I'd been reading Hacker News and other programming forums, and I kept hearing about Lisp. I had no Lisp experience. I'd written in languages like JavaScript and Ruby, and even C# and Java previously, but I kept hearing Lisp was this great kind of mind-bending language that teaches you to think in a different way and allows you to kind of express metaprogramming on steroids. So finally I was convinced I needed to learn Lisp, but so where to start? I got a hold of Land of Lisp, which goes over Common Lisp, and it seemed like a really fun and bizarre way to learn, which was attractive to me since a lot of things are so kind of technical and cold in software engineering. So I started making it through the first few chapters of Common Lisp, started to really get S expressions and homoiconicity and kind of the value of Lisp and thinking in it. But I kind of looked around at what was going on in Common Lisp, and it didn't seem like a very super vibrant community. I wasn't sure if it was the future, if I really wanted to dive in. So around that time, Clojure was also becoming popular. I was seeing a lot of threads and blog posts and so on. So I decided I would switch over. Next, I needed a project to build, something to learn on, something to apply my learnings as I go. And around that time, GitHub had just announced their chatbot called Yetibot, and I thought that would be a fun project. It would be fun to implement myself and kind of build it specifically for my team, for our culture, and the tools that we're using. So I started Yetibot. And I still remember one of the first commands was the ability to generate memes and the feeling of magic when you get your first HTTP client call working in a language. It feels amazing. So I'd wired up a way to take a command in chat, the ability to generate a meme and return the image. And so I took it to my coworkers the next day, and we started playing with it. And pretty quickly we had a set of devoted meme generators, and we would use it to make fun of ourselves, make fun of the languages we used. You can guess what language Blub was at the time in our shop. It's on the JVM as a hint. We would kind of gather around this thing in a chat room. And up until now, a lot of our team was remote, and we didn't hang out in a chat room. This was before Slack. We were using Campfire at the time, but no one really used it because they didn't really see the value. And so Yetibot was kind of a way to bring people into chat and have this kind of distributed async water cooler equivalent for our remote team to just kind of hang out and chat and generate memes and play with the bot. So every day I was evolving it, I was adding features, and it was just a ton of fun. It was a great way to learn Clojure. So here's what Yetibot pipeline parsing looked like. I actually looked up the Git history in 2012. Up until now, I'd been using an assortment of regexes to handle all the parsing in Yetibot, and early on I had the idea to add pipeline capability so that we could express multiple commands and modify them, and basically what Bash gives you. So here's an example of a great kind of library and what's so common in Clojure, where a library comes along and takes something that was fairly academic or hard to learn and makes it accessible to just kind of like the ordinary industry programmers. So I discovered this library, Instaparse, and it ended up being super easy, even though it seemed like a hard thing to do, to get proper expression parsing working in Yetibot using its pretty intuitive APIs and data-driven data structures, results everywhere. So it was a really positive experience, and I felt like I had all this power that the language and the community and the libraries were giving me. So another early feature, around this time our startup had just launched a premium subscription service. And one cool thing about Campfire that Slack doesn't have is the ability to play sounds. So I tapped into our payment processor and would poll for new subscribers. This would happen maybe like 2, 3, maybe 5, maybe 10 times a day. So every time we had a new subscriber, we would hear a sound, which I don't know if we have sound here. But it was a great way to kind of celebrate signups, and we'd all go around the office giving each other high fives. So again, it was like another just part of kind of reinforcing and enriching our culture at the office. So up until now, everything was kind of based around fun. But then I realized like we could actually do useful things with this. We could operate our automation or tap into our cloud infrastructure. So I turned my attention to some of the tools we were using at the time. Jenkins, we would build our jobs and run our deployments from Jenkins. You could list status, list repo or list jobs, and then GitHub was a nice integration because of our naming scheme. We matched all of our Jenkins jobs to the GitHub repos, so we could start listing our GitHub repos and piping those, grepping those, piping them to Jenkins to operate our builds. We also stored production and all of our environment configs in S3. And so we would use Yetibot to kind of pull the Java properties files, parse those, and return those to chat so that we could see what configuration was running in a given environment. We also used this to configure our feature flags. So this was a great way to turn flags on or off in a given environment. And around this time is when I kind of had the idea of Yetibot as a communal command line. We had all this like complex operations stuff. We were using Chef at the time. And it felt like magic. You would run a command in your terminal, and you weren't exactly sure what it did unless you were the person who actually wrote it. And we would do production deploys and stuff like that. But it was pretty unnerving because not being the person who set it up, you didn't really know exactly how it worked and if you were doing the right thing. Contrast that with Yetibot or running commands in a chat setting. Your entire team is there. They can see what you're doing, see if you're making a mistake, or vice versa, like a new member of the team could come into a chat room and see you operating your environment in that context, in the kind of communal context of a chat room, which I thought was a really cool idea and a great way for new people to kind of onboard into the kind of engineering practices of a given team. So a more recent example of a library that again, just provided intuitive APIs and data-driven interfaces was GraphQL. Up until this point, I added a really simple kind of REST JSON interface, but then I discovered the Lacenia library, and again, it was super easy to integrate because you're not dealing with complex class hierarchies and all this kind of domain-specific knowledge of a library. Instead, it's just Clojure maps and function calls. So very quickly, I was able to port the entire API to GraphQL, and today that API powers the web dashboard aspect. So if you go to public.yetibot.com, that's the web dashboard that exposes the internal state of a Yetibot instance running on DigitalOcean, and that's powering the talk today. So a little bit about the pulse of the project. Like I said, I started it in 2011. I've been working on it pretty continuously ever since, especially in the last 6 months, as I've gotten more opportunity to work on it as part of my full-time job. It's about 11,000 lines of Clojure. In a given month, we might have 160 commits from 4 people. Our core team today is 4 people across New York, Paris, Bucharest, and then myself in Montana. And one of our contributors is here today, and had the pleasure of meeting him for the first time in real life yesterday. So now we'll switch over to a live coding session just to demonstrate kind of the typical pattern of contributing to Yetibot. So for a long time, I've wanted the ability to search GitHub, and the GitHub command has a lot of subcommands, but search is not yet supported, so let's add that. So over here, this is the API namespace for GitHub that handles a lot of the kind of API calls, and then we have a command namespace as well. And this is kind of the typical organization in Yetibot. Commands are pretty self-contained, so they're independent of each other, which makes it pretty easy to work on an existing command or add a new command. You just add the new command under yetibot.commands namespace. Command hook is how we hook into the command handling pipeline, and the way it works is you can give it a single regex, or you can give it a map of string topics to regexes. So like for GitHub, for example, that allows us to run GH or GitHub, just because kind of a alias shortcut. And then under that are all the subcommands, and those are just regex patterns mapping to a command handler. So we'll go ahead and kind of stub out what search looks like. So search followed by any number of whitespace characters followed by any character. And that'll be our search query. We'll call that search command. And we want to grab the matched part of the string. So if we look at that regex, the first item in the match from refind will be the entire string, the entire match, and then the second part will be the query. So we can destructure. All commands take a single map as their argument, and that map contains things like information about the chat adapter, like the Slack instance, the user that executed the command, the Yetibot user, any data propagated across a pipe, or string arguments across a pipe. But for this, we'll just look at match. So let's just make sure we have the right part of the regex. And then over in my REPL, I'll run start, and that will start up the chat adapter. So over in Slack, I'm going to switch over to Clojure North Dev so that we don't have 2 Yetibots. Okay, so my REPL's been up for an hour and a half. That's what that's telling us. And if I echo a command, just to make sure, it's showing up in our logs. Okay. So now if I evaluate the GitHub command namespace, it should be available over here. And in particular, we want to look at search, which I'm not seeing. Oh, it's because I didn't add a doc string. So the way help docs in Yetibot work is they extract the doc string for each command as kind of the docs for executing that. So if we add gh search query and reevaluate that, now we should see search showing up as one of the options in GitHub. If we try that, hopefully we'll see our query. Okay, looks good. So the next step is to invoke an API call with that query. So let's switch back to the API namespace. And the API call is actually pretty similar to an existing one where we search pull requests. So we'll kind of model after that. In this case, we're going to search code. I'm going to copy this. And switch to search code. Let's grab the doc string on that. This is the tentacles wrapper around GitHub. So we can see that takes a keywords, query and options. We'll pass keywords in. For now, we don't really care about query. Well, let's do this, merge, since it's an optional parameter. And then for options, we have to pass authentication. That's the primary thing. So evaluate that, and let's try it out. So if I evaluate that, I get a result. Let's print that result out. Okay. So here's the data structure that we got back from GitHub. It contains an items key, and the value is a collection of results. So we can use that, switching back over to the command namespace. We can say let result looking for the alias of the namespace. Okay, gh search code, and then we'll pass query. And like I talked about before, Yetibot propagates the data behind a command, and the way to do that is to return a map from a command that contains two keys, result data and result value. Result value is the kind of human-friendly string representation, and data is the raw data. So let's actually destructure this and grab just the items and return that as data. And then let's map just the HTML URL returned from the API. So I reload that, and we can try it out in Slack. So now we're getting back all these results. We can count them. We could grab a random result, which is nice because then Slack will kind of unfurl it and show the match right in Slack. So searching for command hook is basically a way to query the existing set of commands because every command will use that. But we could also search other organizations and see results from Clojure, for example. So that's kind of the general pattern of contributing to Yetibot. You can add a command, a sub-expression regex to match against that. Usually you make some kind of API call, format the results for human consumption. In this case, all we're doing is grabbing the HTML URL, but if I were to kind of fully build out this command, maybe I'd make it a little more friendly and contain more parts of the map returned from GitHub. So I've written code in a lot of languages over the years, like I said. But lately, I keep coming back to Clojure. Clojure basically had everything I needed when I started using it in 2011, but it's only gotten better over the years. Whether it's things like reducers or transducers, core async, spec, Clojure script, it just keeps getting better. But that's on top of a foundation of something that was already powerful, already had basically everything I needed. So regardless of where you are in your Clojure journey, I would encourage you to continue and help make the community better, write blog posts, release open source. And if you need a project to hack on for fun, or you want to learn in a great community, feel free to join us in Yetibot. Thanks. So we have some time for questions. And if you ask a question, you get a t-shirt.
Thanks for making it. I've got a question about how pluggable it is for other chat systems, like maybe the Matrix protocol or IRC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it has support for IRC already. It started out with Campfire. We removed Campfire because no one uses that anymore. And then the second adapter was IRC. And then the third adapter is Slack. Slack is our primary way we use it, but it still supports IRC, and it has an adapter interface. So for any platform, you just have to implement that interface, and everything will just work.
Cool. Thanks again.
Thanks. Also have stickers, many of them.
Hey, I'm just curious if the backing store is likewise pluggable via protocol or abstracted away from via protocol if I wanted to switch out Postgres? Yeah?
Not yet. So it started, the first data store that I added was actually Datomic, and then I switched to Postgres because I wanted something open source. It's not pluggable, but it probably could be, and I might be looking at that soon because I'm already wondering about Crux. So yeah, that'll be something I'm looking at soon.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks.
Oh.
Cool, thanks.